Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this week's new podcast episode. So today we have a special guest today, attorney Ken W. Good, and today we are going to be talking about how bad bill reforms are substantially affecting domestic violence survivors in this country. So, welcome to the live broadcast and a little bit about Ken before we get started. Okay, so Ken W. Good graduated from Hardin Simmons University in 1982 with a Bachelor of Arts Degree. He received a Master of Education degree in 1986 from Tarleton State University, a part of the Texas A&M system. In 1989, he received his law degree from Texas Tech School of Law, where he was a member of the Texas Tech Law Review. Mr. Good has argued cases before the Supreme Court of Texas and the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, along with numerous Court of Appeals, including the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. Mr. Good is married and has two daughters. And I am so excited to have you here because we need to bring justice and we need to break the silence and bring awareness of this hot topic issue that is affecting many domestic violence survivors. So, first of all, Ken, what inspired you to begin this movement?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I was in Houston, Texas, and someone asked me to attend a hearing on a case called um, O'Donnell versus Harris County. It was one of the very first cases about that kind of launched this bad bail reform movement. And I attended the hearing and I listened to the judge and I was shocked. I thought she was off base. I thought she was going off track. And I thought that this case was going to go south or it was going to go the wrong way that it should go under the law. And so I came out and I started calling my friends and calling, the industry that I work in, which is criminal justice. And I said, set off the alarm. So we're fixing to have problems here. And I will say that's exactly what happened. But I think time has proven me correct because that judge has now been reversed 6, 7, 8 times by the Fifth Circuit. And the Fifth Circuit, in their last ruling, said that this original case that I went to sit in on should have never been filed in federal court. So a complete turnaround and actually kind of a reproach to the federal judge. And these bad bail reforms, so I set out to become very knowledgeable and an expert from a legal standpoint, if that's possible, on these bad bail reform issues. And, we started accumulating data showing that they're not working. And then we kind of figured out, my gosh, they're not working. They're bad for the criminal justice system, but they're even worse for domestic violence survivors. They're driving these people underground because they no longer can have faith in the criminal justice system. They just have to run.
And why is that? Because it seems like that these domestic violence victims are ignored, that law enforcement, there's not enough law enforcement as far as, protecting the woman. In my case, I'm a domestic violence survivor. So, but why are they so lax? What is the problem? Have you ever uncovered that?
Yes, and I would go back to a history of why how we got here, and I would say it all started in California, and the push for releasing criminals was not because we need to be more forgiving on crime. It was arguing that they were not providing sufficient medical care or appropriate medical care to the people in prison because their jail population was 200% of capacity, and so they were ultimately ordered by the federal courts, a panel of 3 judges, to reduce their jail capacity down to 125%, which would just require release of criminals. That case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in a 5-4 majority, which that's the current majority was the minority then, but they're the majority now. But the majority upheld the order, and the minority was saying we cannot order the release of we can't tell a state to release criminals back into society. And so I think everything that's been happening in California from then going forward has not had anything to do about reducing crime. It's reducing the number of people in prison so they can get relief to their jail capacity. The problem is now it's filling back up with really, really dangerous people, and they have no room to do anything else for, misdemeanors or low-level felonies. They just don't have room. And we're seeing that effects go across the country. And then now we have, on top of that, the defund the police movement, where now nobody wants to work for police, for county sheriffs. Nobody wants to work in the jail. And so they're having to reduce their capacity because they don't have the staff even to maintain them. So there's these pushes all over the place to reduce the number of people in jail, but it's not they're saying, well, we're going to reduce more people and it's going to make us more safe. That's the lie. If it's
Oh,
the common sense is if you release more criminals, you're going to have more crime, and that's what we've seen. But the they don't have the political will to build more capacity. And so until they get that, this is where we are. And there's going to be pushes and continual pushes to reduce the prison capacity, which will then cause crime to increase even more. And so if you look at it from that lens, you can see why they decriminalized theft under $950 in California, because they wanted to reduce jail capacity. And it started out by changing felonies to misdemeanors, and then they just quit
mm,
prosecute them. And so if you look at it through that lens, you know why they did it, but the impact you see is natural. It's crime has gone through the roof. And now I think the politicians are stuck. They know what they're doing is bad, but they cannot change it because otherwise they'll be attacked and replaced by some other
mm.
politician who will get in line with what the elites want right at the moment.
Wow. Oh my goodness. And how about the legislatures? Because is this issue being ignored by our legislatures? And I'm not just talking about Texas, I'm just talking about the whole country
Well,
in
it depends
general.
on where you live. New York passed bail reform, and depends on where you live what they call it. But in New York, they called it released on zero bond or no bail, so you got released without a bond. Same, and California calls it release on zero bond. Texas calls it release on personal bond. They're all simple release mechanisms where it doesn't cost you anything to get out of jail. You're just getting out of jail based upon your promise. New York did reforms, and then they've now rolled them back 4 times. They still have more rollbacks to come, I believe. They say they're done, but they're still having crime go up. As long as crime's going up, you need to roll back these reforms. And the reforms, I think, all have a common element. We're taking away the discretion of judges. I say we're tying the hands of judges, and we're doing it in the name of we're protecting the poor. But when we do that, we're also tying the judges' hands so they can't address career criminals, they can't address gangs, and they can't address organized crime, and they can't address the people committing these heinous offenses against domestic violence survivors.
Wow. Yeah, they're heinous. I mean, they're just hideous. I mean, I've had women come to me and telling me that, okay, for instance, the criminal or the ex or the soon to be ex, the abuser, has been released on bail. And literally, the woman has been severely beaten. So that's why I asked that question about, lack of enforcement.
Well, we have different types of release. And so if they're released on these simple release mechanisms, and I have multiple examples where somebody was just simply released and they went back and killed somebody, killed their partner that didn't want to be with them anymore. But if they're released on a surety bond where they have to come up with money to post it, there's a cooling off period, and usually their family has to get involved. So that requires them to kind of think twice sometimes. So I think there's a level of protection that they for domestic violence survivors if they don't use simple release mechanisms. In Texas, somebody accused of domestic violence can be held without bail, but it's still a misdemeanor crime in Texas. So they're not held very often. And so it's very difficult to hold them. And because it's a misdemeanor, then, all these bail reforms that have been pushed, we
Mm.
should just be concentrating on the violent offenses. I mean, but I think of Caitlin Guajardo out of Harris County in Houston, Texas, where her
Okay.
husband had been arrested, and then he was released on a personal bond, and then he got arrested short time after for beating his wife, and they gave him, so he was already out on bail, and he got arrested on new charges for beating his wife. He got another personal bond, released very quickly, and within hours,
Mhm.
he killed her and stabbed her 30 something times in her stomach because she was pregnant. And he told the officers when he was arrested that if he was not going to raise this child, he did not want any other man to raise his child for him. And so he stabbed her 30 something times in her stomach. He is still awaiting trial in Harris County years later, but we did file a bill in the
Mm.
Texas legislature called Caitlin's Law, and it was ultimately uh, uh, taken into its elements, taken into another bill. So the ultimate bill that passed is not called Caitlin's Law, but the things that she and her family or her family wanted were incorporated into an ultimate bill. And so we do have some legislatures like Texas that are strengthening bail, and so they're not doing these bad bail reforms; they're doing the opposite. And so
Mhm.
so you're seeing the people are coming in and saying this isn't working, we got to pull it back. You're seeing it all over the country. You've got Alaska that tried it and then rolled it back, and you've got other states that have tried it and rolled it back. California put it up for a referendum and it was voted down, but you still have LA County trying to ignore the voters and just uh, release people on zero bail, uh, even though the voters rejected it. And again, remember, in California, it doesn't have anything to do about crime. It has everything about reducing the prison population because they're so full.
Oh my goodness. That poor woman who was stabbed 30 times. And see,
Yeah.
that would have been prevented if there were better law enforcement.
Well, the judge had the
Mm.
discretion to hold this person, but they didn't. They released him on a personal bond. If they had just set a high, since he was already out on bail, committed a new crime, they had every right to set a high bond. He probably would have stayed in jail for a few days, which would have let him cool off. But he was immediately
Oh,
released, went back. Her mom told me that she asked her to leave when he was arrested, come stay with her. And she said,
absolutely.
no, no, he's already out on bail. He'll never be, they're not going to let him out. So I've got time. And that's probably the last thing she told her mom.
How sad. That
Hmm.
is so sad. Very sad. I mean, imagine that. Those were her last words.
Well, and we now are seeing data coming in from COVID because California tried this zero bail during COVID, and so there was a study released by the Yolo County District Attorney's Office that found if you release somebody and you compare the difference between somebody released on a surety bond where they have to put up money versus just being simply released on low level offenses, the people released on simple release have a 200% greater chance of committing a violent offense
Mhm.
in the next 18 months. Now, that just seems to be common sense with us, on domestic violence situations, because if someone gets arrested, they're angry at their significant other accusing them of that and they immediately get released, they're going to go act on their anger. But if they have to have a little cooling off period or they get held for a while and they have to come up, or family has to come up with the resources for them to get released, maybe they will calm down. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But the victim has time then to decide, what do I do? I mean, domestic violence victims are already, before this bail reform, were questioning whether, they could count on law enforcement because they're told, oh, well, you need a protective order. Well, if they're hot and mad, they don't have any problem violating a protective order. Then the next thing is they violate a protective order by killing the person. So they already have questions, but these changes that we're seeing has completely altered the landscape. Domestic violence survivors no longer are even taking the time to call law enforcement. They're just running. They need to run and hide.
So they have to like escape. And I know for myself, I had a plan in place, but there were times when I had to leave, like literally be out the door,
Yeah.
be out the door. And, like a lot of these domestic violence victims, they're single mom. I mean, they're mothers, you know what I mean?
Yes.
They have a child, and that makes it more difficult for them. So how do they, go about doing that, with a child? In my case, I had no children, so mine was even though the process was hard, I can imagine what they go through, you
Yeah,
know?
I agree with you. I mean, it makes it
Mm,
very difficult, but also I think it gives some people an added motive. They need to protect their children. I kind of wonder, were there any red flags in your relationship that said, "Hey, this person's going to go unhinged"? I mean, what advice would you give to someone at looking back on your situation?
mhm.
I mean, were there anything that you look back on and said, "Hey, I ignored this red flag"?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
When I mean, I was older when I got married, but one of the things that I was in a church in a Sunday school, and one of the things that we all kind of taught in our Sunday school class was that we should know somebody for 4 months, for 4 seasons before we get married, and the whole argument was they can hide or we can hide who we really are for a couple of weeks, a couple of months, but we can't do it for 4 seasons. I don't know.
Yeah, he was hiding it at first, and I did not spend 4 seasons with him.
Hmm.
So, it was, like a couple of seasons, and, um, unfortunately, I was physically struck
Hmm.
and in the hospital. But guess what? It took me another 7 years. You know why? Because like women, like myself, I felt ashamed to break the
Sure.
silence at that time and tell the authorities because I thought the authorities wouldn't do anything.
Well, and I'm not critical at all of I mean,
Yeah.
it's like, how do we stop something that I mean, there are situations where the person just becomes an animal after marriage, they change, and, there's just different situations across the board, and so we have to, I wanna support domestic violence survivors, and we all need to support them, but I don't think we realize that these pushes for criminal justice reform, and these are pushes, they're not tried or tested theories that anyone has ever said, "Oh, these work." These are things that were just given a, okay, let's try this because the other side has a lot of money and a lot of people pushing for it. And so let's try it. And it's failed everywhere. But right now in Harris County, the DA's race is a moderate Democrat in the primary versus a very left leaning Democrat. And the left leaning Democrat says the private surety bail system is the problem, and they've got to get rid of them. He's ignoring all the data that says as they've reduced the use of private surety bonds for misdemeanors, crime has taken off. Failure to appear rates have taken off. And as a result, nobody comes to court. There's some data that there's an 80% failure to appear rate over 2 years for the misdemeanor courts. And he's ignoring that. What impact does that have? It creates huge backlogs with the courts, and that
Mhm.
creates pressure for the courts to just dismiss cases. I looked at a month's worth of cases that were resolved in Harris County and for all the misdemeanor courts, and over 90% were dismissed. So that's how they're preventing or keeping their criminal justice system from collapsing. And these cases are usually start out as misdemeanors until there's a death. When there's a death, then there's a separate case that's filed that's a felony. So all the red flags are appearing in misdemeanor court, and we're doing everything we can to make misdemeanor courts completely chaos, and no one shows up. And if they do, nobody's doing anything to them. We're removing accountability, and that's sending a green light for criminals to commit more crime. And that's before we even get to the domestic violence section of this criminal justice
Mhm.
fiasco.
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, if someone, if a domestic violence survivor unfortunately dies, then that's when they really enforce it. But the time to nip it in the bud is now. Meaning,
Absolutely. I mean,
yeah.
but then it becomes a violent felony, and so they say they're concentrating on violent felonies. But
Oh,
my
really?
all the misdemeanor people today are in training for tomorrow's felons. That we're putting them in a really bad situation. We're making their situation worse. Can you imagine if we got just a third of the domestic violence accusers to calm down and not take the next step to really harm somebody. I mean, a third, that would be, we would be wanting to give an award to whoever came up with whatever program that they're doing to
Right.
to do that. And we're doing the opposite. We're increasing it by at least a third, probably even more, because now we have underreporting. We have jurisdictions saying, "Oh, crime's going down," and you
Mhm.
could even say in the domestic violence area, since people are just running, they're not reporting because they have no faith. They would be saying, "Well, crime's going down on domestic violence. Look at the statistics." And I'm like, "No, no, no. If you want a true measure of how crime is going right now in the United States,
Mhm.
you only have to look at car thefts, because car thefts, insurance companies still require a police report before they will pay off that claim. And
Wow.
car thefts are going up by 30% or 20 something percent annually. And so, as a metric of how crime is going up in our urban areas, it's going up quickly, it's going up dramatically, and people are trying to hide it. And it's having those ramifications across the spectrum, especially on domestic violence survivors.
Jeez. I never, I'm so glad that you're here breaking the silence and talking about this because this is so important and there needs to be reform. So let's talk about that throughout the nation because I know that I think that you had mentioned here reform efforts have gained momentum in recent years despite increasing pushback. So can you elaborate on that for us,
Well,
please?
sure. I think that, I mean, in our urban areas, we still have pushes for reform, even though the data is showing that it's not working. And you've got other areas pulling back. You've got even in the left leaning urban areas, you're seeing signs that it's gone too far. In Oakland, the NAACP and Oakland chapter has requested or demanded of their local officials a state of emergency on crime, saying crime has just gotten too bad. And recently, the California governor sent additional California Highway Patrol officers to Oakland to address crime. So they just brought in more officers because nobody wants to work for Oakland right now because they went through that defund the police movement.
Oh,
They have
yes,
all
yes.
these,
They even tried that up here in Saratoga during
yes,
COVID to
and
defund the
so,
police system. I'm like, "What?"
but
No.
bringing more officers came, and it had an impact because they had a lot more arrests. And so when you have arrests and you hold people accountable, that changes the mindset. I like to look at the best example of what to do is a case called Sanchez versus Alabama. It
Okay.
it had to live under one of these preliminary injunctions, ordering them just to do simple release for 3 or 4 years. And then it went up on appeal and they won. And so I talked to the sheriff and I asked him, "So what happened after y'all won?" He said, "We were able to re-implement a system of accountability. And if you
Okay.
didn't come to court, there were consequences for it." And he said, "It took us 6 months to change the mindset of criminals, and
Mhm.
crime went down." We have to get
Wow.
away from these theories, which are not taught in any textbook on criminology, and there's nothing that says they work. All we're being told is this is what we should do out of fairness. We need to get away from all the rhetoric, all the politics, and we need to go back to what we know works. And if that causes more arrests than what we have capacity for, then we have to build additional prisons or capacity until crime starts going down. We're repeating the cycle that we had in the 60s. In the 60s, we felt safe. We
Mm,
were more forgiving on our crimes.
mm,
We released more people from jail. Crime went up. And then we had a strong debate and a fight over how to get control over it. The left, one side of the electorate fought it tooth and nail, and it ended up having a backlash. Reagan came in with the fight on crime, with a strong crime
mm.
bill. And in the 80s, we built additional prisons and we started feeling safe again. What we're going through right now is just like we went through in the 60s. We felt safe, we felt more forgiving, and now we're reaping the consequences of it.
I agree with you. We are reaping the consequences of it.
Mhm.
We definitely are, because I'm very passionate about helping domestic violence survivors, especially finding resources. So, are there any resources that you provide for domestic violence survivors? And I understand that you have a website and a blog. So, let's talk about it.
Well, if you want to find out more information about what we do and the stories that we highlight, you can go to our website, pbtx.com. We have a blog there where we highlight important stories across the country. But we also have our own podcast, which is focusing on criminal justice issues. It's called thebellpost.com. There is a link to it on our website, but you can also just go to thebellpost.com. Uh, it is intended to be a resource for law enforcement, a resource for judges, and for um, legislators, state legislatures about these criminal justice issues. So when someone says, hey, we should be adopting the New Jersey plan, we have an episode about what the New Jersey plan is. And
Oh,
so
thank you.
that is what we want. We want to accumulate data and we want to be a place to go to educate people on what these issues are. And before we were having our podcast, before we started releasing data, I started writing articles on these things, nobody was telling the truth. I mean, nobody was giving out uh, that uh, that when you try these simple release mechanisms in misdemeanor court in California, they have an 80% failure to appear rate, and nobody's going to arrest them when they don't come. Nobody was saying that in Harris County, when they're doing this right now on misdemeanors, that the police officers union looked at 1 week's data and found they had a 75% failure to appear rate. And then a group downloaded 2 years worth of data from the clerk's office using the same formulas and found an average of an 80% failure to appear rate over 2 years. And so what did the courts do in response to that data? They quit requiring anybody to come to court. They didn't try to fix it. They just made it even worse because criminal cases have to be put on hold when you don't come to court. And
Mm,
so what we're trying to do is give a voice
there you go.
to
I was just about
domestic
to say
violence
that.
survivors and with data and with information. And I'm hoping that we can pull all these groups together and we can go to these legislatures and say, enough is enough. We need to stop these bad bail reforms and we need to put victims first, not criminals first, which is what we're doing right now. We're putting criminals over victims.
Oh, that's a sore spot for me. Criminals over
It
victims.
should be a sore
That's
spot
a
for
huge.
everybody.
It should be a sore spot for everyone, is right. So I'm grateful that you started your podcast, um, thebailpost.com. I love the name. So that is essentially a resource for law enforcement and actually domestic violence
Yes.
victims for them to tap into, because every state has different laws.
Yes, and we
And
do highlight the different laws in different states
yeah,
about what they've done on bail reform. We also highlight, how people get released in different states. And so we are doing our part to try to educate the public as well.
that's great. Now, in the state of Texas, how is that going? I mean, in the state of Texas, is do victims have a voice or not?
Well, 2 sessions ago, Texas passed SB 6, which was their major bail reform bill, but it was not bad bail reform. It was good bail reform because it limited the use of these free bonds for certain offenses.
Mm,
And also said if you're out on bail and you get rearrested, then only if it's both felonies, then only the judge of the first court can set bail for the second. So they strengthened the bail system. But the problem that we have is there was a cleanup bill in this last session, SB 1318, something like that, and it did not pass, and it was because of politics. There was the chairman of the Criminal Justice Committee in the House, didn't let it go through till the very last minute, but he wanted to make changes to it. And one of the changes was he wanted a presumption of a misdemeanor for all misdemeanors. So, I mean, a presumption of a personal bond for all misdemeanors, which would include domestic violence survivors, accusers. And so that was not supported by the original author, and the bill it ended up not passing. So we still have some cleanup to do, and I think that will happen in the next session. We were hoping it would happen in some special sessions, but it seems like the governor and the House and the Senate are fighting, and the governor's pushing for vouchers to be used in Texas, and there's a big fight against that, and so now the governor's supporting people who helped him and opponents in primaries, which are a week and a half away, and so we just have all this infighting going on with the Republicans right now that we need to get past. Some
Right.
people are worried that that might push the state more to the left, but I don't think so. I think the ultimate result will be that um, those people will probably be reelected, and then there will be a stalemate because there'll be continued infighting between the Republicans.
See, and that's what bothers me because this issue, I'm glad that we're breaking the silence and bringing awareness of this because this particular issue is shoved under the carpet. No one, you don't hear anyone talking about it. I don't hear
You know
anything.
what we always have our best result when we have a day at the Capitol. And
Ah,
so
there you
we
go.
bring in a lot of people. And so we need some domestic violence survivor days at the Capitol where
I
people
like
come
that.
in
I would be there. I would be
and
there.
go around and meet with legislators and say, this is what you're doing to us. This is what, and if we could concentrate on the people that are opposing these reforms and tell them the impact of what they're doing, I think that would be immensely helpful.
That would be immensely helpful is right. People like myself, people, women to actually go there. We actually have an organization here in New York. Um, so, but they're always pushing. They're always I'm not there, but this organization, they're always at the Capitol pushing because we have a voice.
Absolutely. We need a voice. We need a loud voice. We need a
Mm,
voice as big and as loud as the old voice of Mothers Against Drunk Driving. They've kind of gone quiet now, but we need a voice as loud as that voice used to be.
well, let's work on that, ladies. Let's work on that,
Absolutely.
ladies.
Absolutely. And we need to be
Right.
able to have a rallying call. We need to have a call to action by whatever this group is called, just the domestic violence survivors. Call to action and go wherever we are needed to get the word out that what they're doing is making it where domestic violence survivors are not even, I mean, they're not even members of the of society anymore. They have to run and hide for their own safety.
Yeah, that's a
We have to
shame.
stop that.
And we need to stop, and we have to stop that. And even for me, I had to escape and I had to leave the house. I
Mhm.
was the one who had to leave. So when the police came because he did something, um, which wasn't necessarily physical, but emotional, which is just as bad, and he was threatening, I was the one who had to leave.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, these are really bad situations because my experience as an attorney for over 30 years, and thank you for
Okay.
highlighting how old I am because I'm just ancient. But, you know, what I've seen at courthouses and at the Court of Appeals is all of the shootings are family related. They're not crime related. So,
Mm,
I live in Smith County and we had a shooting at the courthouse. It was a family law case. And in Fort Worth, years and years ago, we had a case go up to the Court of Appeals for argument. And someone brought a gun and started shooting at the three judges on the panel hearing the case. That was a family law case. So, you know,
what?
violence at the courthouses are usually family law related. It's kind of
Mm,
scary.
that is scary. I mean, imagine being in court, and then all of a sudden,
Yeah.
uh, that's scary. That's scary. Fortunately, that did not happen to me. So I'm grateful that I was able to eventually make a plan, hire an attorney, and escape domestic violence. And I moved to upstate New York. So I'm glad that I was able to escape. And that's it. It's just I was actually talking to I wanted to bring this up. I was talking to a woman last night. I went out to dinner, and this woman, she escaped domestic violence. Her ex is, like he's
Hmm.
narcissistic. And something happened in Florida, which was so repulsive that unfortunately her daughter was there to witness it. And her daughter had to leave.
Hmm.
And the daughter, okay, so let's talk about this for a second. Maybe you could shed some light. So the daughter doesn't want to see the father again, and now the father is dating a girl that is basically her age, so like 25 years apart, I would say. When I
Mhm.
look, and she showed me the photo too, and I just found that so repulsive. Like,
Yeah, I think I think these situations,
mm,
one of the things we probably should talk about, does that make it impossible to trust again someone in a
mm,
relationship? I think it may make it almost impossible to trust someone again. But there was a girl, and I can't remember her name, but she was kidnapped and she was held by this person. And when she was finally found, her mom gave her this advice: do not let this person destroy the beauty within you.
oh, I
And
love
the
that.
best thing you can do is go on and live a happy life, because that will hurt them more than anything. And I think, I mean, it's easy to say, but it's hard to do, because I know I'm the worst about, I give trust willingly, but if you destroy my trust, I don't
Mhm.
know if you can regain it. And so if I was a domestic violence survivor, it would be very, very hard for me to find the ability to trust someone again to start over. But I would encourage, in the right situation, maybe, I mean, the reason why Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, works so well is it has at its heart that there is a supreme being. And so the whole program is built around that. Doesn't um, propose any religion, but there is this concept of a supreme being. And so I kind of wonder if we wanted to rebuild trust, if we started with rebuilding our relationship with our faith,
Okay.
and then from there built out. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I want
Mm,
to rebuild our survivors so that they can be happy and productive, and they can do all the damage to their attackers by being a happy and successful person.
exactly. Exactly. Unfortunate, and I agree with you. Totally agree with you. Rebuild faith. That's what I did. I had to rebuild my faith and trust in God again. So that is something that I teach, my clients, is to
Mhm.
rebuild that trust and faith, because a lot of women lose trust and they lose faith and belief, and they feel lost and overwhelmed. And especially with all these, things happening in court. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, I
Oh,
was,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Well, let me make
And that
2
makes
points.
it worse. And that just makes it worse because our legislatures are ignoring
Mhm.
it.
Well, I wanna make 2 points about that. The first one is, someone taught me, or someone told me one time, that we can just teach morality. We don't have to teach faith. We just have to teach morality. But I was watching a film, and it made the point that when you teach morality without attributing it to faith, you're just teaching your opinion. And they can come back and say, it's just your opinion. If I don't agree with it, then I don't have to do it. And that kind of had an impact on me. If we don't attribute morality to faith, then it may be just our opinion. And it's more than an opinion. And so maybe we need to attribute it to faith. And the second thing that I would say about the faith is, uh, I'm not coming from an experience where I haven't been touched. I have a grandfather who was the anchor in our family, and he had he got sick, and he got sick for like the third time, and so he decided he didn't wasn't going to fight it, and so he committed suicide. And at the time he committed suicide, I did not even know what my faith believed about suicide. I had to call my pastor to find out, do we believe he does not go to heaven? That this is an unpardonable sin? And my faith taught that it was a sin, but the only unpardonable sin was the sin of non-belief. But and so as a result of that, when I go through something really bad, I lean on my faith. I don't turn my back. I have a daughter who's when she was 5, had a bone marrow transplant. And a lot of people were saying, how can you, I mean, why aren't you blaming God? I'm like, are you kidding me? If I did not have my faith in God, I would never be able to get through this situation. And she's now a freshman in college, doing well.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I'm very happy to hear that. Very happy to hear that. I want to talk about the billpost.com podcast.
Hmm.
So, okay, you started that, I believe you told me 3 years ago.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so what inspired you to start the podcast? And tell us about the podcast so our listeners can go listen to your podcast.
Well, I think so. Our episodes kind of fall into, I would say, one of three categories. One is teaching about something, a concept like what's the New Jersey plan, or what is the bill that's being proposed? What is this concept? If we're going to amend the Constitution, what's the impact of it? And so one is instructive. Another part of it is to build relationships. So we do episodes with judges, explaining about how they set bail, with sheriffs talking about the jail population. So I did an episode with the sheriff of Tarrant County, and he said 80% of the people in his jail share three things. One, they have no education. Two, they have no father in their life. And three, they have some outside influence, such as drugs, gangs, or mental health issues. And so then our third part is where we highlight studies, or we accumulate data and we release that data. So there, the narrative is that the number one reason why people languish in jail is because they're poor. And we need to do all these changes to protect the poor. Well, there's a study on that. It's been released in Florida, and I talked to the guy that released it. And the number one reason he found that people languish in jail is their criminal history, not because they're poor. And so when you start looking at those types of things, and nobody else is highlighting them, I mean, nobody is highlighting that, these simple bail release mechanisms, or just simple release mechanisms in California, are causing an 80% failure to appear rate. Nobody was highlighting in Harris County that 75% failure to appear rate in the misdemeanor courts. And nobody was highlighting that there's this website, harriscountycourtwatch.com, that says for 2 years, on average, it's an 80% failure to appear rate. And then nobody's highlighting this study from California where it says a simple release over a release on a surety bond increases the chance of a violent offense in the next 18 months by 200%. And so this is all valid data, and it needs to be held somewhere in some library so that when we have people pushing. So like Harris County in Texas is driving bail policy, but everybody in Texas knows it's terrible. But we
Yeah.
have people in Harris County going to other states saying Harris County is the gold standard and they should start doing that as well. Well,
Wow.
nobody was accumulating that data to tell these people that they were lying. And then we also highlight important cases. Like, when this bail reform movement started, they said, well, bail's unconstitutional, so it's going to change. So we might as well adopt these changes. Well, that's been held. That argument's been rejected. And then, I mean, here's the best example I have for why we do the bail post. There's this group, and it's called Civil Rights Corps. They're the ones that file these lawsuits across the country. And they were quoted in the Dallas Morning News in the last month. And they said, every trial court that has looked at a case that we have filed has found that bail was unconstitutional. Well, what they left out is every court of appeals has reversed those trial courts, and they are batting zero out of 5 cases going to the U.S. Supreme Court. So they've lost everything. And the problem is they keep making the same arguments, even though they've been rejected by the courts of appeals, and they keep making them and ignoring the courts of appeals like the courts of appeals never ruled. And so I think it's getting to the point where they need to start being sanctioned. The reason why they're doing all that is because they're raising millions and millions and millions of dollars from donors to make those arguments. They're not, imagine if they'd have spent that kind of money helping domestic violence survivors. I mean, they would actually
Exactly. Our money is being wasted, essentially. I believe
absolutely,
so.
absolutely. And the most recent
I think
case,
it's
the most
not
recent
money,
case was
actually.
just denied by the U.S. Supreme Court Tuesday of this week. So, I mean, they're batting 0 out of 5 cases. I mean, they haven't won on one. They've been reversed every time.
Why is that? Why are they
Because they're
reversed?
wrong. They're absolutely wrong in their arguments. They're arguing that bail is unconstitutional, and it's been held constitutional twice. They're arguing procedural. Well, I mean, we could go on and on about the semantic, I mean, the minutia of what they're arguing, but they're arguing procedural due process violations, but they want substantive remedies. So they want, oh, it's violating procedures. Well, if
Mm,
it has a procedural problem, procedure is your remedy. But they're saying, well, no, 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 the remedy is to get rid of bail. No. So if you're arguing that the problem is you don't have an opportunity to ask for a bail reduction, then your remedy is a hearing to ask for a bail reduction. Well, they're not arguing for that. They're arguing that your remedy is you have an absolute right to release because you're poor. Well, if the judge can't hold you, period, they can't hold gangs, they can't hold
mm.
career criminals, they can't hold organized crime people, and they can't hold domestic violence assaultants,
Got it. Got it.
perpetrators.
Perpetrators, right,
Yeah.
exactly. Well, I'm so glad that you came on my show today to bring awareness and talk about how bad the bail reforms are. And they've unfortunately have had a substantial effect on domestic violence survivors. And they are being ignored by our legislatures.
Well, I
So,
think we're starting to see it turn
okay,
from the mayors. The mayors are going to be the ones that are turn this because they're seeing how it's impacting their tax revenue because commercial
I was just
buildings
gonna
are
say that.
going down. They're going so far down in their valuations. Commercial buildings in San Francisco are selling for 30% or 50% of their value from 6 months ago.
And San Francisco used to be like the city to travel to.
Yeah. And yes, and now the Nancy Pelosi federal building told all the federal employees there work from home. It's not safe to come to work.
And I have a friend who lives in, I don't know where he is now, but he lives in San Francisco and he actually works from home.
Hmm.
Yeah, we're all like working remote now.
Yeah.
It's
Well, and they
you
want to
know,
say, oh, the whole reason why these buildings are going down in value is because of COVID and because of people are working remotely. No, it's because of crime. You've got businesses closing because they can't survive $25,000 a day in shoplifting in California, and you've got businesses that are now closing because they can't provide a safe work environment for their employees, and they can blame it on um, remote work all they want. It's public safety. If you can't
I
provide a
agree with
safe
you.
place, then you're going to lose your city.
I agree with you. I totally agree with you. And that's important. Public safety is number one priority for any, like any employee. That is, or even someone like myself who owns I also have a coaching business and podcast. For me, safety for me is working from home
Hmm.
because I know what goes on out there.
Yeah.
It's not pleasant.
My
It's
wife
not
makes
very
fun of me
pleasant.
because every day I go home and on the way home I stop at the store and I may buy one or two things. It's just part of my routine. I go to the grocery store, but that's part of my routine. It's part of where I feel safe. I meet all the people in my town. We live in a small town outside of Tyler. So
Oh,
it's just
nice.
it's our community. We have gotten away from our sense of community,
Mm, there you
and
go.
we need
You
to get
touched
back
on
to that.
something. We need to bring back the community again. I totally agree with you. So we're coming up at the top of the hour right now. This is a great discussion, eye-opening discussion. So in closing, what inspiration and hope would you like to share for domestic violence survivors in these crazy times that we live in now?
Well, I would start by saying I'm praying for you, and I want only the best for you and your kids, your daughters, and your sons. And if there's anything that I can do to help, I want to do it. I think that we do have hope because what's going on currently is not sustainable. It
Mm,
cannot continue because if crime continues to go up, then we're going to have vigilantes looking for justice. And so I like to say that our current trajectory is not sustainable. And you see the mayors coming out demanding change in our urban cities because they see their tax base going down, and we know what that's going to cause. There's going to be defaults by the buildings, then the defaults by the cities. And you already see a division arising where people are moving from areas where there's no public safety to areas where there are. And that's not sustainable. And so there will be a change. It's coming. And so there is help coming on the way. In the meantime, do what you have to do to protect yourself. And then when you have opportunities to raise your voice and say, this is what I went through, please don't make anyone else go through this. Help domestic violence survivors. Call me to come with you, and I will stand by your side.
And thank you so much for providing your amazing words of wisdom and inspiration and hope, Ken. And I'm so glad that you were a guest on my podcast, to break the silence and for us, for women, to amplify their voices, because we do have a voice and there's power in our voice. So I want to say thank you, Ken, for being a special guest on my podcast, Let's Break the Silence with Angeline. This podcast episode will be live on my YouTube channel, which is Let's Break the Silence with Angeline, on Wednesday morning, this Wednesday at 8 a.m. Eastern Time, and also on my Spotify, which is Let's Break the Silence with Angeline. Please reach out to Ken at pbtx.com, and also resources, the bailpost.com, which is, from what I understand, it's the top 10, I think one of the top 10 podcasts for criminal justice
Yes.
in the country. And congratulations. Congratulations on that. Very, very, this is good that we're bringing awareness and breaking the silence. And please reach out to Ken for support, ladies. Okay. So I'm going to end the broadcast right now. And Ken, please stay with me in the green room. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and have a good one. See you
Bye.
soon.